Johnny Carson looked calm, charming, and unshakable on camera. But behind the curtain, he kept a quiet list of people he never wanted to face again. Some were loud, some were sneaky, and one was so beloved that viewers would never guess Carson could not stand them. These were not small misunderstandings either. These moments pushed Carson past his limit, leaving a mark he never forgot. And when you see who he blocked from ever returning, you will understand why his crew still whispered about this list decades after he retired. For 2 decades, Joan Rivers was more than a regular guest. She was one of Johnny Carson's favorite people to bring on the show. Carson praised her timing, her sharp wit, and the way she could lift a dull night back to life. When he told her early in her career, "You are going to be a star," he meant it. Viewers loved the chemistry. Producers considered her the closest thing Carson had to a true on-air partner. That is what made what happened next feel like a gut punch to everyone inside The Tonight Show. As the 1980s rolled on, Rivers felt stuck. Her guest host appearances made her famous, but she wanted something bigger. Her own show, her own stamp, her own identity. When Fox launched its new network, they offered her exactly that, a chance to host The Late Show starring Joan Rivers. It was a massive opportunity, but the way she handled it turned a career move into one of the most bitter late-night breakups in television history. Rivers later said she tried to tell Carson, but every version of the story from The Tonight Show staff says the same thing. Carson learned she signed the contract from the press, not from her. When he saw the headline, he called her immediately and asked if it was true. Rivers confirmed it. Carson hung up the phone. That was the last time the two ever spoke. For Carson, loyalty was everything. You did not blindside the man who gave you a platform. You did not step into his time slot without a conversation. He saw it as betrayal, not business. After that call, her name vanished from the booking list permanently. Anyone who suggested bringing her back was shut down instantly. The doors were closed for life. The coldness shocked the entire industry. Even decades later, crew members said they never saw Carson take anything as personally as Joan Rivers leaving for FOX. It was not just a feud. It was the wound that stayed with him all the way to his retirement. But Joan was only the beginning. The next guest did not land on Carson's bad side because of business, but because he confronted him in a way no one else ever dared. If Joan Rivers represented the painful betrayal, Wayne Newton represented the moment someone finally pushed back. Most guests treated Carson with a mix of respect and caution. Newton was not one of them. He had worked in Las Vegas for years, built a massive following, and was used to handling tough crowds. But nothing prepared viewers for the night Newton took aim at Johnny Carson himself. It started with jokes. Carson had hinted on air that Newton was too soft, too polished, and maybe too dependent on his charm. These jokes were not vicious, but they hit a nerve. Newton built his entire career on his image, and he was not about to let anyone tear it down, especially not on national television. One night, after another joke at his expense, Newton decided he had enough. He came down to NBC personally, walked straight into Carson's office and confronted him. People who were there said the room went silent. Newton leaned across the desk and told Carson to stop. He said he was tired of being the punchline, and he would not tolerate being mocked for ratings. Most people would never dare speak to Carson like that, but Newton was a different breed. He was fiery, emotional, and fiercely protective of his reputation, and in that moment, he made it clear that he would fight back if he had to. Carson did not fight. He did not yell, but his face said everything. He hated being challenged, especially by a guest. Producers said that after Newton stormed out, Carson sat in silence before telling his team, "He does not come back," and he meant it. Newton was removed from the guest rotation immediately. The staff stopped pitching his name, and the subject quietly disappeared, just the way Carson preferred his conflicts. This feud became one of the rare moments when someone forced Carson to face criticism directly, and even though Newton walked away feeling victorious, the band spoke louder than anything said in that office. Carson controlled his world completely, and once you crossed him, you were out for good. But if Newton clashed with Carson through confrontation, the next guest made the mistake of bringing attitude onto the set, long before the cameras even rolled. Cher was already a superstar by the time she sat across from Johnny Carson, but fame did not guarantee a warm welcome on The Tonight Show. Carson expected guests to respect the rhythm of the show, ease into the conversation, and treat the set like neutral ground. Instead, Cher walked in with a level of blunt honesty that caught him completely off guard. In one early appearance, Carson teased her about her rising success. It was gentle, classic Carson humor, the kind of banter every guest expected. But Cher fired back, calling the show lousy in her own sharp, sarcastic way. The audience laughed, but Carson did not. He was known for being able to roll with any joke, yet something about her delivery cut deeper than expected. It was not playful. It was not witty. It was a shot that landed too close to his pride. Producers said Carson felt she was disrespectful, not as a performer, but as a guest. For him, the show was a temple. You were supposed to treat it with reverence. Cher's carefree attitude broke that unwritten rule. She was bold, unfiltered, and seemed to challenge him without even trying. Each time she appeared, the energy shifted. Carson would sit a little straighter, listen a little harder, and work twice as fast to maintain control of the conversation. By Cher's later appearances, the tension was impossible to ignore. Carson kept his smiles shorter, his questions more direct, and his responses clipped. The spark he usually had with strong personalities simply was not there. Behind the scenes, crew members said Carson felt she pushed the line of respect, and that was something he never forgave easily. Cher was never officially banned, but she was quietly phased out, and the invites slowed to a crawl. And while Cher's attitude rubbed Carson the wrong way, the next guest did something far worse. He turned chaos into live television in a way that forced NBC to step in permanently. Bobcat Goldthwait did not just bring energy to a talk show. He brought a storm. His comedy was frantic, unpredictable, and built on the feeling that anything might happen next. That style played well in nightclubs, but inside Johnny Carson's carefully controlled world, it created the kind of tension that producers prayed would never hit live television. From the moment Bobcat walked onto the stage, Carson braced himself. Guests usually eased into a rhythm: setup, punchline, conversation. Bobcat ignored all of it. He bounced from topic to topic with no warning, delivering jokes like he was trying to outrun his own thoughts. Carson kept a polite smile, but he was watching every move. He liked lively guests, but he hated losing control, and Bobcat had no interest in letting him steer the moment. One appearance in particular became infamous. Bobcat turned his energy up so high that the entire studio felt it. He jumped out of his seat, paced around the desk, and yelled lines so unexpected that even the band stopped laughing. Carson tried to rein him in, but Bobcat's whole act relied on showing he could not be reined in. To the audience, it looked hilarious. To Carson, it was a nightmare. But the real breaking point did not happen on Carson's show. It happened on another NBC program. During a promotional appearance, Bobcat suddenly lit a chair on fire. Not as a joke, not as a prop. He actually set the thing ablaze on live television. Security rushed in. Producers panicked. NBC executives were furious. It crossed every safety line in the book, and it terrified the network. And that was all Carson had to hear. The rule at The Tonight Show was simple. If the network banned someone, Carson banned them harder. Bobcat's name was cut from every future list. There were no discussions, no arguments, no second chances. Carson valued order. Bobcat represented the exact opposite. Even years later, Bobcat joked about the ban in interviews, but the people who worked in Carson's studio remembered it differently. They remembered the way Carson tensed every time Bobcat walked on set. They remembered the sense of relief when NBC finally stepped in and removed the chaos for good. The ban was not personal, it was survival. Carson built The Tonight Show on precision, timing, and trust. Bobcat lit those principles on fire the same way he lit that chair. But as wild as that moment was, the next guest did something far more delicate. He pushed Carson's buttons not with chaos, but with jokes sharp enough to cut right through him. Don Rickles and Johnny Carson were a rare pairing, two television giants who could bring out the best in each other while also pulling each other to the edge. When Rickles walked onto the set, the entire studio shifted. Crew members sat up straighter. Camera operators braced themselves. Even Carson, who rarely showed nerves, visibly prepared for impact. Rickles was not just another comic. He was a force of nature, and no one knew quite how hard he would hit on any given night. Rickles' act revolved around rapid-fire insults, but his targets were usually ordinary audience members. On Carson's show, though, he went after the host himself. He joked about Carson's marriages, his stiff posture, his wardrobe, even his signature calm demeanor. Most guests would have seen these topics as off-limits. Rickles saw them as invitations, and while the audience roared, Carson sometimes froze for a split second, just long enough for longtime viewers to notice. The most iconic moment came after Rickles broke Carson's cigarette box while guest hosting with Frank Sinatra. Nobody expected Carson to react the way he did. Instead of shrugging it off, Carson marched directly into the studio where Rickles was filming CPO Sharkey, barged into the taping, and confronted him in front of the entire crew. It was funny on camera, but behind the scenes, Carson was genuinely irritated. Personal items mattered to him. Respect mattered to him. And Rickles had a habit of pushing both without thinking twice. What most people never realized is that the tension did not end there. Over the years, Rickles took jabs at Carson's divorces, hinted that Carson was detached from real people, and even mocked his nerves around conflict. These jokes were part of Rickles' act, but Carson lived by rules of privacy, control, and emotional distance. Rickles bulldozed all three. Every appearance became a tightrope walk, with Carson laughing for the audience while quietly deciding when he needed a break. Producers later admitted there were stretches where Rickles was intentionally not booked, not because he failed to deliver ratings, but because Carson needed time to cool off. The two men liked each other deeply, but the relationship was filled with moments that could flip from warm to ice cold in a heartbeat. Rickles loved mischief. Carson loved order. That clash created iconic television and a private tension that lasted for decades. Still, as complicated as that dynamic was, it did not compare to the next guest. He did not bring chaos. He did not bring insults. Instead, he brought a personality so overwhelming that Carson felt drained every time he came through the studio doors. The next name created friction slowly and silently, until Carson finally stepped back altogether. Buddy Hackett was a powerhouse comedian with a distinct style, loud, physical, unpredictable, and never afraid to cross lines. Carson appreciated raw talent, but there was something about Hackett that rubbed him the wrong way. It was not a single moment or explosion. It was a long, slow build of tension that grew every time Hackett visited the studio. Hackett's humor leaned toward the outrageous. He loved stories that flirted with the edge of what NBC could air. Carson, who protected the show's image fiercely, hated having to police guests in real time. Hackett also had a reputation backstage for taking over conversations, steering things toward himself, and ignoring the pacing Carson worked so hard to maintain. Staff members said Carson felt drained after episodes featuring Hackett. Their relationship worsened when Hackett publicly complained that Carson did not book him enough. He joked about it on talk shows, but the frustration behind the humor was real. Carson heard the comments, and he did not appreciate being criticized by someone he had already grown tired of. Unlike other comedians who blended easily into Carson's world, Hackett always felt like he was pushing just a little too much. Carson never banned him, but the distance was noticeable. Invitations slowed, segments shortened, and the door quietly inched shut. But while Hackett was a slow burn, the next guest created tension instantly, with an interview style that seemed built specifically to irritate Carson. Charles Grodin walked onto Carson's stage with one goal: to mess with the format. His entire late-night persona revolved around deadpan irritation, sarcastic complaints, and tense, uncomfortable energy. Audiences loved it. Carson did not. Grodin would show up pretending to be angry at the show, annoyed with Carson, or bored by the questions. It was an act, but it worked a little too well. Grodin interrupted. He contradicted Carson. He dragged out pauses to the point of painful silence. Carson, who valued flow and precision, struggled. He liked playful banter, not passive-aggressive performance art disguised as conversation. Viewers at home sensed the discomfort. Some thought it was brilliant, others thought it was strange, but in the studio, the tension was real. Carson would whisper to producers after the segment, asking, "Why does he do this?" Grodin became one of the few guests who could push Carson into visible frustration. The more Grodin leaned into his awkward persona, the faster Carson seemed to retreat. Eventually, producers spaced out his visits, letting months turn into years. The appearances never fully stopped, but the chemistry never improved. And if Grodin pushed Carson's patience with awkward tension, the final guest pushed it physically, with moments that made Carson genuinely uncomfortable. Animal segments were a staple of The Tonight Show, especially the ones handled by Joan Embry and later Jim Fowler. Viewers adored them. Carson tolerated them. But behind the scenes, he dreaded them more than almost anything else. Animals were unpredictable, messy, and completely uninterested in Carson's carefully crafted timing. And every time one of these segments appeared on the schedule, Carson braced himself. The famous moments tell the story. A panicked emu kicking Carson, a monkey jumping on his head, a snake nearly escaping across the desk. Carson would try to smile through it, but his nervous glances gave away the truth. He hated not knowing what would happen next. Crew members said Carson would warn producers to keep the wild ones under control, which was never possible. Some of these segments made television history. Others made Carson genuinely uneasy. In the later years of his career, he requested fewer animal appearances, and some handlers were quietly rotated out. Not because of any single disaster, but because Carson felt the animals disrupted the show more than they helped it. For a man who valued control, precision, and predictability, these segments represented the exact opposite. They were wild cards, and Carson had spent enough years playing along. Johnny Carson ruled late night with charm, timing, and absolute control. But behind the camera, he carried memories of every slight, every clash, and every moment that broke the rhythm he protected so fiercely. Joan Rivers, Wayne Newton, Cher, Bobcat Goldthwait, Don Rickles, Buddy Hackett, Charles Grodin, and even the animal segments each touched a nerve in their own way. And together, they revealed something most viewers never saw. Carson did not just host the show, he guarded it. And anyone who threatened it, even for a moment, never forgot where they stood.